I quite liked the old MSI G2421 when I reviewed it back a few years ago, and the G2412 is supposed to be the successor. So it's gonna be even better, right? Well, it wouldn't be the first time that a monitor has gotten worse than its predecessor, but we'll see. Spec-wise, there really hasn't changed a lot. This still is a classic 24-inch IPS monitor of the 144Hz class. Okay, the refresh rate has been bumped up to 165Hz with a 170Hz overclocking option, but that's about it. Even from the outside, the G2412 looks identical to the old model. That's really not a bad thing though, as I still think it's one of the better looking affordable monitors out there. The stand is even made from metal, which is pretty rare at this price point. Keep in mind though that this is a tilt-only stand with no height adjustment whatsoever. Back when I reviewed the G24 I actually found the default height was perfectly fine, but no wonder how I was using the monitor back then without getting neck pain. But I guess that's just me getting older. Anyway, I'd recommend making use of the VESA mount on the back of the monitor. Now even though it still looks the same, the updated version now uses a different panel. It's still a TPV panel from the same series, but this is the LF4F variant instead of the LF1F that's been used previously. This should be the same panel that AOC used for the 24G2 SPU, but as you're gonna see throughout this video, the performance in some areas is actually quite different between AOC's and MSI's monitors, so there's a chance that the displays are actually not the same despite using the same panel. And of course, the G2412 doesn't measure or look the same as the G24 which is pretty much expected given the panel update. Luckily though, just like the old one, the new panel still has one of the best native contrast ratio of any IPS panel. It's almost hitting 1500 to 1, which isn't something a lot of IPS panels can do. Unfortunately though, it also has inherited the way too high minimum brightness. 122 nits in the lowest setting is just way too bright for using this monitor at night in a dark room. If you're planning to use it in a bright room though, the high maximum brightness of just over 400 nits really helps with battling the ambient light. 400 nits are actually very bright for a monitor in this price range and about 80 nits more than the previous version had. Now one thing that's a step back from the previous version is the color gamut volume. Colors on the G2412 are less saturated, as the color gamut volume has actually gotten significantly smaller. It's now a standard gamut monitor with a color gamut volume of just about the size of sRGB. On a positive note, this means that sRGB content won't look oversaturated. Unfortunately though, this doesn't automatically mean that colors are going to be accurate. The default setup is actually pretty far from being color accurate. The white point is off, the gamma is too high, and the overall accuracy is pretty bad for a standard gamut monitor. But MSI also implemented an sRGB mode, and at least it brings the gamma closer to the sRGB gamma curve, but that's about it. In return, it blocks the color temperature adjustments, so I wouldn't recommend using this mode. You're better off using some custom settings, and this is where I ended up with after playing around with the settings. A bit unfortunate that MSI don't include a gamma setting, so there's no way to bring down the gamma with the OSD menu, but still it's an improvement over the default settings. Though from a standard gamut monitor, I'd honestly expect better results. Especially the delta E is just too high, considering oversaturation can be causing this. It's fixable with a full calibration and profiling, and the ICC profile also fixes the gamma system-wide, but yeah, most colorimeters are more expensive than this monitor if you don't have the opportunity to rent or borrow one. In case you don't have access to a colorimeter, you can also download the ICC profile that I've made for this monitor from the video description. It's meant to be used with these settings, which I found to give the best accuracy. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about response times and ghosting. MSI gives us the choice between 3 different overdrive modes. Even the fastest mode doesn't show inverse ghosting, so that's great to see. However, we still can spot regular ghosting in the middle track, so the G2412 surely isn't the best tuned or even the fastest monitor of this class. But we'll take a look at some comparisons in a minute. Fortunately, the fastest mode can be used throughout the refresh rate range, and it's pretty much optimal down to 120 Hz. Below that, it starts to show inverse ghosting. It's still usable, but you might want to switch to the normal mode for best results. Now taking a look at the response time measurements, they confirm what we've already seen in the UFO photos. The G2412 is measuring an average response time of 7.4 milliseconds, which surely isn't the fastest we've ever seen in this class. For some context, the Mobiuz EX240 is almost 2 milliseconds faster on average. But it's also a bit more expensive than the MSI. Now side by side, the difference isn't as large as the response time numbers might suggest. Sure, the EX240 has less ghosting, particularly in the middle track, but the MSI really doesn't look too bad in comparison. The Koorui 24E3 looks slightly better than the G2412, but here the differences are even more subtle. The G2412 really looks a lot like the 24G2 SPU by AOC, which really isn't a surprise given that these two basically use the same panel. And in case you're wondering, there has been slight improvement in motion clarity and response times over the old MSI G241. Now MSI also implemented a backlight strobing mode. However, this mode really isn't worth turning on. There is just lots of crosstalk and ghosting. The comparison to some of the best backlight strobing modes out there shows neatly how bad it actually is. So let's just move on and talk about display lag. And good news, the display lag is basically as low as it gets. Just 0.1 milliseconds of processing lag at 165 Hz as well as in the 170 Hz OC mode is a great result. And it's the same with adaptive sync turned on or off. Speaking of adaptive sync, despite the lack of the NVIDIA G-Sync certification, the adaptive sync performance is flawless. I wasn't able to detect flickering or any other defects. And LFC kicks in at around 55 FPS and works perfectly fine, so that's great to see. Now you probably have noticed that the G2412 is advertised as a 170 Hz monitor instead of the typical 165 Hz. And yeah, it happily clocks at 170 Hz, but for some reason you have to dig deep into the menu and toggle on the DP overclocking mode to enjoy the sweet 5 Hz boost. And this actually is the reason why I only showed response times and test UFOs at 165 Hz. I simply didn't notice the overclocking option before making these tests. But yeah, here are the 170 Hz response times for the most relevant mode, in case you're curious. And I've also been using the 170 Hz mode while gaming. And no surprise, it looks virtually identical to 165 Hz. But yeah, the overclocking option works flawless for me, so I don't see a reason for not turning it on. Okay, so is the G2412 worth buying? Or is it just another one of those monitors that have gotten worse than the predecessors? Well, it's more affordable than the previous version, so that's a good start. It's coming in at $130 US at the time of making this review, but prices change, so please make sure to compare prices before buying. I've got the G2412 and some alternatives linked down below. Of course, the price drop from the previous version is much appreciated, and some things even have been improved. It's a bit faster now, and the maximum brightness is higher. Really, the only thing that has gotten worse is the color gamut volume, so overall the G2412 actually is a slight improvement over the old G241. However, the monitor market has been moving forward as well, and there now are monitors like the Mobiuz EX240 that the G2412 has to compete with. And for many people, the $30 or so higher price of the EX240 is money well spent for a slightly faster monitor with better color accuracy, a height adjustable stand, and a minimum brightness that's actually usable at night. One of the few reasons why you might want to get the G2412 instead is its higher contrast ratio. It's not a night and day difference, but the contrast bump is nice to have for content consumption. I guess if you want to save a few dollars, the G2412 is also a valid option, but then there's also the Koorui 24E3 that often can be had even cheaper and also isn't too far off performance-wise. So yeah, the G2412 kinda sits in a weird spot, being beaten by the EX240's performance and by the Koorui 24E3 when it comes to price. I'm gonna link the reviews of the EX240 and of the 24E3 on screen right now, and I'd suggest checking them out if you're in the market for an affordable 1080p monitor. Thanks for watching, bis zum nächsten Video.